The camera opens on the Arizona Territory, 1886. The pre-dawn darkness clings to the Sulphur Springs Valley as a lone ranch house sits silhouetted against the emerging light. Inside, an oil lamp flickers. Narrator: some stories are too powerful to fade with time. This is the story of John Samuel Carter, a man who spent 30 years fighting Apaches, only to give them everything he owned at his final days. What happened at sunrise on that September morning would become legend, whispered around campfires, recorded in journals, and remembered by two peoples who had spent decades trying to destroy each other. John Samuel Carter wasn't born in the West. He arrived in 1856 from Missouri, a young man of 22 with dreams of land, cattle, and a new life far from the crowded East. What he found instead was a land caught in a brutal, generations-long conflict that would define his entire existence. By 1886, Carter was 52 years old, though he looked 70. 3 decades of frontier life had carved deep lines into his weathered face. He'd been shot twice, knifed once, and had survived diseases that killed harder men. He'd fought in more skirmishes with Apaches than he could count, buried 2 wives and 4 children to frontier violence and disease, and had built his ranch, the Tierra Madre, into one of the most respected operations in southern Arizona. But now, cancer was eating him alive from the inside. The doctor in Tucson had given him 3 months, maybe 4 if he was lucky. That was 6 weeks ago. Carter sat in his ranch house, staring at the deed to his 8,000-acre spread. He'd built this place with blood, sweat, and tears, both his own and others. The land was worth a fortune by frontier standards. Eastern investors had already approached him, offering $50,000 for the property. His remaining family, distant cousins back east, were counting on an inheritance. But Carter was thinking about something else entirely. It was a day in 1862 that Carter could never shake. He'd been part of a militia pursuing a band of Chiricahua Apaches who had raided a neighboring ranch. They caught up with them in a narrow canyon, and the fight that followed was brutal and close. Carter had cornered one warrior, a young man, maybe 19 years old, in a dead-end arroyo. The Apache's rifle was empty, his bow broken. He stood there, tall and proud, waiting for death with the kind of courage that Carter, even in his hatred and fear, couldn't help but recognize. Their eyes met. In that moment, Carter saw not a savage, not an enemy, but simply another human being who loved this land as much as he did. Another man fighting for his home, his family, his way of life. Carter lowered his rifle. He didn't know why. Every rational thought told him to pull the trigger. Instead, he turned his horse and rode away, telling the others that the canyon had been empty. That Apache was named Nate, nephew of the great Cochise. Carter would learn this years later, in one of those strange twists that the frontier seemed to specialize in. By then, Nate was imprisoned at Fort Marion in Florida, one of hundreds of Apaches exiled from their homeland as punishment for simply existing. Over the years, Carter's perspective had slowly, painfully shifted. He'd seen too much. He'd fought Apaches, yes, but he'd also seen what white settlers did to Apache women and children. He'd watched the army burn Apache crops and homes. He'd seen poison put in springs where Apaches watered their horses. He'd witnessed the forced marches to reservations, the starvation, the betrayals. He'd also come to know individual Apaches, scouts who worked for the army, peaceful families trying to survive on the reservation at San Carlos. He'd learned their language, heard their stories, understood their history with the land. The Sulphur Springs Valley, where he'd built his ranch, it had been Apache territory for centuries before he ever saw it. One Apache scout named Chato had once told him, through a translator, "We do not hate you, cowboy. We hate what you represent, the taking of what was never yours to take. But you are just a man trying to live, same as us." That conversation haunted Carter for years. Now, dying and facing whatever came after death, Carter couldn't stop thinking about justice. Not the frontier kind, the kind dispensed through guns and rope, but real justice, the kind that acknowledged debts that could never be repaid, wrongs that could never be made right, but could at least be recognized. Carter called for his lawyer, a man named Thompson who rode out from Tucson. What Carter proposed was so unusual that Thompson initially refused to write it up. You want to sell your ranch, worth $50,000, to the Apache people for $1? John, are you out of your mind? Your family will contest this. They'll say you weren't of sound mind. Carter's eyes, still sharp despite his dying body, fixed on the lawyer. Then you make damn sure that document is ironclad. I am of sound mind, Thompson. Maybe the soundest it's ever been. This land belonged to the Apaches long before it belonged to me. I took it. We all took it. I can't give it all back, but I can give back my piece of it. The government won't allow it, Thompson protested. They'll seize the property before they let Apaches own it freely. Carter had thought of that, then worded carefully. Sell it to representatives of the Apache people who can hold it in trust. Find a way, Thompson. You're supposed to be the smartest lawyer in the territory. It took 2 weeks of legal maneuvering, but Thompson found a way. The ranch would be sold to 3 Apache scouts, men who had served the army and had limited property rights, for $1. The deed included provisions that it was to be held for the benefit of the Apache people, with special language that made it nearly impossible for the government to seize, without obvious theft. Carter sent word through Chato, the Apache scout he'd known for years. The message was simple but extraordinary. Tell your people, the ranch is theirs. Come at sunrise on September 15th. Come in peace. Come to claim what was always yours. Chato was stunned. Why would you do this, Carter? We have fought you. We have killed your friends, your family even. Why? Carter's voice was weak but steady. Because I'm dying, and I want to die with a clear conscience. Because this land was never really mine to take. Because 30 years ago, I let a young warrior live when I should have killed him. And that one moment of mercy showed me that we're not so different. Tell them to come. Tell them it's not a trap. Tell them I'm sorry. The word spread like wildfire through the Apache community, both on the reservation and those few still free in the mountains. A white rancher was giving back land? It was unheard of. Some thought it was a trick. Others were suspicious of any white man's generosity. Slowly, but Apache leaders began to believe. September 14th, 1886. Carter sat on his porch as the sun set over his land. His ranch hands had all been paid off and sent away. He wanted no one else there for what was coming. He was alone except for one Mexican servant, Maria, who had refused to leave him. "Are you afraid, Senor Carter?" she asked, bringing him water. "Yes," he admitted. "Not of the Apaches. I'm afraid they won't come, or that they'll come and won't understand what I'm trying to do. I'm afraid this will be meaningless." But deeper than that fear was a strange peace. For the first time in 30 years, Carter felt like he was doing something right. Not legal, not proper, not what society expected, but right in a way that mattered to the soul. He didn't sleep that night. The pain in his body was intense, but he refused the laudanum. He wanted to be fully present for what came next. September 15th, 1886. The sun began to break over the Chiricahua Mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Carter, wrapped in a blanket against the morning chill despite it being September, sat on his porch and waited. And then, as the first rays of sunlight touched the valley floor, they came. They emerged from the hills and arroyos, like ghosts materializing from the earth itself. Not charging, not whooping war cries, but moving in complete silence. 70 Apache warriors, maybe more, mounted on horses, dressed in traditional clothing, armed but with weapons sheathed or held at rest. It was the most magnificent and terrifying sight Carter had ever witnessed. They spread across his land that had been theirs once, in a great semicircle. The silence was absolute. No words, no sounds except the soft footfalls of horses and the whisper of the wind through the grass. Among them, Carter recognized faces. Chato was there, and old Nana, one of the last great war leaders, now ancient but still commanding respect. There were younger warriors, their faces painted. There were older men, scarred from decades of fighting. Each one represented a story, a tragedy, a fight for survival. An older Apache, a medicine man named Eusebio, rode forward. He dismounted slowly and approached Carter's porch. Behind him, the 70 warriors remained absolutely still, watching. Eusebio spoke in Apache, which Chato translated. The cowboy Carter sends word that he returns our land. We come to see if his words are true, or if this is another white man's lie. Carter stood, his legs shaking from weakness. Maria helped him down the porch steps. He held the deed in his hand, the legal document that Thompson had prepared, along with a simple bill of sale. $1 for 8,000 acres of prime Arizona rangeland. It's true, Carter said, his voice carrying across the silent valley. This land was yours before it was mine. I took it. I built on it. I made my fortune from it. But I took it from people who loved it first, who belonged to it in ways I never could. He held out the deed. I can't give back what was lost. I can't bring back the dead. I can't undo 30 years of war. But I can give back this piece of earth and say that I was wrong. We were all wrong. Eusebio took the deed. He looked at it for a long moment, though he couldn't read English. What mattered wasn't the words on the paper. It was the gesture behind them. Then something happened that no one expected. The 70 warriors, as one, dismounted. They didn't approach aggressively. They simply stood beside their horses, and then, slowly, they sat on the ground. It was a traditional Apache gesture of respect, of recognition that something sacred was taking place. These were men who had fought the U.S. Army, who had never surrendered in their hearts, who had lost everything, and they were showing respect to an old cowboy who had once been their enemy. Eusebio spoke again, and Cheto translated. The cowboy Carter gives back what he took. This is good. This is right. We accept this gift not because we needed his permission to love this land, but because he acknowledges that it was ours first. That is worth more than the land itself. Then Eusebio reached into his pouch and pulled out something, a small leather pouch decorated with beads. He handed it to Carter. Medicine. Cheto translated. For your pain. For your journey. You go to the spirit world soon. This will help. Carter, tough old rancher, who hadn't cried since he was a boy, felt tears running down his weathered. What happened next became the stuff of legend. The 70 Apache warriors didn't leave. They stayed, sitting in silence on the land that was now legally theirs, as the sun climbed higher in the sky. They stayed through the morning. They stayed as noon approached. It was Cheto who finally explained to Carter what was happening. They are bearing witness, Cheto said. They are marking this moment. They want to remember. They want their children to remember that once, one white man tried to make things right. Around midday, the warriors began to rise. They mounted their horses, still in silence. But before they left, each group rode past Carter's porch, not threateningly, but slowly, deliberately, allowing him to see them and allowing them to see him. Some nodded. Some placed fists over hearts in salute. The younger warriors looked curious, wondering at this strange white man who had done something none of their elders had ever seen before. The older warriors looked at him with something that might have been forgiveness, or at least understanding. And then, as silently as they had come, they departed, melting back into the hills and valleys that had always been their home. Carter lived for 6 more weeks. The story of what he'd done spread rapidly. Ranchers called him a traitor. Businessmen called him insane. The army investigated whether he'd violated any laws, but there was nothing they could do. The sale was legal, the deed was ironclad, and Carter had the right to sell his property to whomever he chose. The Apache people who now legally owned the ranch didn't try to settle on it immediately. They understood that the government would find ways to take it back if they weren't careful. Instead, they grazed horses on it, used it for traditional gathering, and guarded it carefully. Carter died in late October 1886, with Maria at his side. His last words, recorded in her journal, were, "Tell Eusebio, tell him thank you, for letting me die with honor." The ranch remained in Apache hands for 7 years before the government found a legal mechanism to seize it, citing some obscure clause about land rights and tribal law. But those 7 years mattered. They proved that Apaches could manage land successfully. They provided a gathering place for traditional ceremonies. They offered hope during the darkest period of Apache history. More importantly, the memory of what Carter did lived on. It became a story told in both communities, among whites as a cautionary tale or an inspiring one, depending on who was telling it, and among Apaches as proof that not all white men were the same, that some could see beyond their own interests to a greater truth. In the decades that followed, a few other ranchers, inspired by Carter's example, made small gestures toward reconciliation. They weren't as dramatic, a water right restored here, permission for traditional gathering there, but they mattered. The story of the 70 warriors sitting in silence on that September morning became part of Apache oral history. Elders told it to children, who told it to their children. It was a story about dignity in defeat, about recognition of truth, about the possibility of honor even between enemies. Years later, a historian interviewing elderly Apache survivors of the reservation period asked about John Carter, an old man named Dakluji, who had been one of the young warriors present that morning, said something profound. That white man couldn't give us back what was lost. He couldn't bring back the dead or return the years of freedom. But he gave us something we desperately needed in that dark time. He gave us recognition. He said, "You were right. This was yours. I took it wrongly." That cost him nothing but meant everything. It didn't change history, but it changed how we remembered one white man. In a time when we were told we were savages, he treated us as people who deserved justice. That was perhaps the real significance of Carter's act. It wasn't about the land itself. 8,000 acres couldn't compensate for the millions lost. It wasn't about the money. $1 was symbolic, nothing more. It was about acknowledgement. It was about one man saying, clearly and publicly, "We were wrong. You deserved better. I can't fix the past, but I can recognize the truth of it." Carter's story raises difficult questions that echo through American history. If one man could recognize the injustice of taking Apache land, why couldn't the government? If 70 Apache warriors could sit in peaceful witness to an act of return, why did the wars have to continue? The answer, of course, is that Carter was dying and had nothing left to lose. The government and the white settlers had everything to lose, or thought they did. Empire isn't built on justice. It's built on taking and holding. Carter's individual act of conscience couldn't stop the machinery of conquest, but it did prove something important. Reconciliation was possible. Understanding was possible. If enemies who had spent decades trying to kill each other could find a moment of mutual respect and recognition, then maybe the conflict didn't have to be inevitable or eternal. Today, the land that was once Carter's ranch, and briefly Apache land, is divided among several private ranches. There's no marker indicating what happened there in 1886. Most people who live in the area don't know the story. The physical evidence has been erased by time and development. But the story survives because stories like this are too important to forget. They remind us that history isn't just about great armies and famous leaders. It's also about individual choices, moments of conscience, and the possibility of doing right even when everyone around you says you're wrong. The image of 70 Apache warriors sitting in silence on reclaimed land as the sun rose over Arizona is powerful precisely because it was so rare. It represented a road not taken, a possibility that existed but was never fully pursued. What if the taking of Native American land had been accompanied by recognition of wrong, by attempts at justice, by actual negotiation rather than conquest? That morning in September 1886, when 70 Apache warriors filled Carter's land in silence, they weren't just accepting a deed to property. They were bearing witness to a rare moment of honesty in a dishonest time. They were marking the occasion when one white man acknowledged what most refused to admit, that the land had been taken, that taking it had been wrong, and that the original inhabitants deserved recognition of that truth. The silence they maintained wasn't empty. It was full of grief for what had been lost, respect for Carter's gesture, and a kind of tragic dignity that comes from knowing that justice, when it finally comes too late and too small. Carter didn't save the Apache. He didn't stop the wars or end the suffering. His one ranch returned couldn't compensate for millions of acres stolen. But he proved that individual humans can choose honor even in a dishonorable system. He showed that recognition of truth has value, even when it can't change facts. And in that sunrise moment, as 70 warriors sat in silence on land that had always been theirs, something profound happened. Two peoples who had been enemies found a moment of mutual understanding. It wasn't peace. The wars would continue. It wasn't justice. The wrongs were too great to rectify. But it was recognition, witness, and acknowledgement. Sometimes, in history, that has to be enough. Historical note: this narrative is inspired by documented acts of reconciliation between individual ranchers and Apache people in the late 19th century, though the specific story of John Carter is a composite based on similar real-life gestures. The historical context: Apache land dispossession, the reservation system, the relationship between some Apache scouts and white ranchers, and individual acts of restitution, is authentic. The gesture of selling or returning land to Apache people did occur in rare instances, though specifics are often lost to history. This story honors those who chose conscience over convention, even at the end of empire.